In the vast quiet between snow-lined streets and glass towers reflecting pale northern light, there exists a rhythm of social order that often unsettles Americans upon arrival in Canada. The surface appears familiar, shared language, similar storefronts, parallel skylines, but beneath the visual symmetry lies a choreography of behavior that operates by different rules. What feels casual in one country can feel unexpectedly structured in the other. The shock rarely comes from grand political contrasts. It comes from silence, from restraint, from the subtle weight of collective expectation. Many Americans first notice the softness of volume. Conversations in cafes rarely rise above a low murmur. Public disagreements seem to dissolve before becoming scenes. Even joy is often expressed with tempered composure. To those accustomed to expressive affirmation or open frustration, the emotional climate can feel muted, as though a layer of insulation surrounds every interaction. It is not coldness, but calibration. The word sorry drifts constantly through Canadian air, not always as apology but as social lubricant. It appears in doorways, in grocery aisles, in minor inconveniences that would pass unspoken elsewhere. Americans often interpret it literally at first, wondering what offense has occurred. Gradually, it becomes clear that the phrase is less confession than ritual, a gentle acknowledgement of shared space. Lines form differently. In airports, in coffee shops, even at bus stops, Canadians tend to organize themselves without instruction. The queue becomes an invisible agreement, an unspoken contract. Americans sometimes step forward instinctively, guided by efficiency, only to sense a shift in the atmosphere. No confrontation follows. Instead, there is a pause, a collective stillness that communicates disapproval without words. There is also the quiet authority of rules. Regulations are not merely guidelines but expressions of communal trust. Whether recycling protocols or winter parking restrictions, compliance carries moral undertones. Americans accustomed to negotiating boundaries may feel an unexpected gravity in these systems. It is less about enforcement and more about shared responsibility. Humor, too, carries different codes. Canadian wit often leans towards self-deprecation, understatement, and subtle irony. Bold declarations can appear abrasive. Confidence is expected to travel with humility. Success is acknowledged, but rarely amplified. Americans who are socialized to project ambition sometimes sense the need to lower their volume, not only vocally, but symbolically. Over time, patterns reveal themselves in small exchanges. Neighbors wave but rarely intrude. Invitations are extended thoughtfully, with careful planning. Personal space is both physical and emotional. The rhythm is slower, yet not idle. It is measured, intentional, protective of harmony. For Americans immersed in this environment, an internal recalibration often begins. The impulse to assert softens. Pauses lengthen. Awareness sharpens around the edges of shared experience. What once felt restrained begins to feel considerate. What seemed overly cautious reveals itself as collective choreography. The hidden rules are not written in policy but in posture, in the distance maintained on sidewalks, in the moderated tone of debate, in the reflexive courtesy that cushions friction before it sparks. And in that quiet choreography, Americans often discover that the greatest differences are not loud at all. Beneath this quiet surface, Americans begin to recognize that Canadian society is guided less by visible hierarchy and more by emotional equilibrium. Social harmony is treated as a shared asset, something delicate that must not be fractured by excessive certainty or personal dominance. In professional settings, meetings unfold with careful pacing. Interruptions are rare. Even disagreement is wrapped in prefaces, softened with qualifiers, balanced with acknowledgement. Direct confrontation, common in many American workplaces, often feels out of place. Many Americans notice how consensus is prioritized over speed. Decisions may take longer, but the process itself carries symbolic weight. Inclusion is not merely procedural, it is cultural. Voices are invited, perspectives are weighed, and even when authority ultimately decides, the path toward that decision is intentionally collective. Efficiency yields slightly to cohesion. Patriotism, too, operates quietly. National pride is present, but it rarely announces itself with grand display. Flags are visible yet understated. Pride often manifests through policy, through healthcare systems, public broadcasting, or environmental protections. Americans accustomed to overt expressions of national identity sometimes sense an unusual subtlety. Identity is affirmed without proclamation. Social welfare systems reflect another hidden rule, the assumption that vulnerability is communal. Healthcare, parental leave, and public services are structured around shared responsibility. Americans often arrive with questions about cost, about sustainability, about choice. Over time, the deeper cultural assumption becomes clear. The system reflects an agreement that security is not solely individual. It is collective insurance against unpredictability. Even small talk carries coded restraint. Conversations rarely probe too deeply into income, political allegiance, or personal success. Privacy is respected almost ceremonially. Americans who are comfortable sharing ambitions or debating ideology may sense a gentle redirection toward neutral terrain, weather, travel, cultural events. The avoidance is not indifference. It is protection of civility. In urban spaces, multiculturalism is treated not as spectacle but as structure. Diversity is acknowledged through policy and everyday interaction, yet rarely dramatized. Canadians often describe identity with layered nuance, careful not to elevate one narrative above another. Americans accustomed to louder conversations about identity sometimes feel the difference in tone. Discussions unfold with deliberation rather than urgency. There is also the discipline of winter itself. Harsh seasons demand preparation, cooperation, and patience. Snow removal schedules, coordinated infrastructure, shared awareness of weather risks, all reinforce collective reliance. Americans who experience these climates notice how resilience is communal rather than heroic. Survival depends on systems functioning together. Gradually, Americans perceive that assertiveness does not disappear in Canada, it transforms. It becomes measured, strategic, and often indirect. Influence is exercised through relationship rather than volume. Authority speaks calmly. Criticism arrives cushioned in courtesy. The absence of overt friction does not mean absence of conviction. It means conviction expressed with restraint. These hidden rules rarely announce themselves. They reveal their presence through subtle shifts in atmosphere, through the way a room responds to raised voices, through the weight of silence after a boast, through the gentle correction embedded in a polite smile. Americans often find themselves recalibrating instinctively, adjusting tone, slowing pace, sensing boundaries that were never explicitly drawn. As months pass, what once felt restrictive begins to feel stabilizing. Americans who remain within Canadian society long enough often experience a quiet shift in perception. The constant need to signal individuality softens. The urgency to win conversations fades. In its place grows an awareness of collective rhythm, an appreciation for steadiness over spectacle. Public life reinforces this transformation. Debates remain firm yet measured. Media narratives avoid theatrical intensity. Political disagreements unfold within boundaries of civility that prioritize continuity over rupture. Americans accustomed to sharper polarization sometimes sense a calmer civic temperature. The atmosphere does not eliminate tension, but it absorbs it differently, dispersing heat before it ignites. Social trust becomes visible in ordinary gestures. Wallets dropped on sidewalks are often returned. Public transportation operates with minimal enforcement presence. Strangers exchange restrained nods that acknowledge mutual belonging without intrusion. Americans gradually notice how predictability itself creates comfort. Systems are expected to function. Institutions are presumed reliable until proven otherwise. Ambition, too, undergoes reinterpretation. Achievement remains valued, yet its presentation is filtered through humility. Professionals speak of success in collaborative terms. Promotions are framed as team victories. Even entrepreneurial ventures are described with cautious optimism rather than triumphant declaration. Americans shaped by competitive narratives sometimes discover a quieter satisfaction in shared accomplishment. There is also an emotional recalibration. Expressiveness does not vanish, but it is channeled with awareness of impact. Laughter fills rooms, yet rarely dominates them. Frustration surfaces, yet rarely overwhelms communal space. Over time, Americans often begin to internalize this modulation. Pauses lengthen before responses. Tone becomes deliberate. Confidence learns to coexist with deference. The hidden rules reveal themselves not as constraints, but as agreements. They are woven into how doors are held open, how disagreements are phrased, how diversity is navigated without spectacle. They form a social architecture that values equilibrium over intensity. Americans who adapt to this structure often find that their own emotional registers shift accordingly. In the end, the shock gives way to understanding. Beneath the quiet apologies and orderly cues lies a cultural philosophy built on preservation of harmony. It assumes that society functions best when friction is softened, when pride is moderated, when responsibility is shared. For Americans observing this landscape, the contrast becomes less about difference and more about design. Canadian society does not announce its rules with force. It expresses them in silence, in moderation, in the space left between words. And in that space, Americans often come to recognize a distinct vision of community, one where strength is measured not by volume, but by balance.